My wife told me, quietly, one evening after 20 years of marriage, that she wanted one night with someone else before we settled fully into growing old together. A kind of final curiosity, she called it, something she needed to close a door on before she could commit completely to the rest of her life with me. I told her I understood and that I wouldn't stand in her way. What she didn't know was that the moment she left the house that night, I made a single phone call. My name's Edward. My wife, Susan, and I had been married 20 years, with 2 adult children who'd both recently moved out for college and careers of their own. For most of those 2 decades, our marriage had been genuinely solid, not without ordinary struggles, but built on a foundation I'd always trusted completely. Over the past year or so, though, something had been shifting. Susan seemed increasingly restless, occasionally distant, prone to long silences where I could tell she was working through something she wasn't ready to fully articulate. I asked gently, several times over those months, whether something specific was bothering her. She always deflected, framing it as general midlife reflection now that the kids were gone and the house felt quieter than it had in decades. I didn't push aggressively, though the distance genuinely concerned me. I'd started privately, doing some of my own reflecting as well. Not about leaving exactly, but about honestly confronting whether our marriage, however solid it had been, might be heading toward a kind of quiet, mutual drift that neither of us was addressing directly. The conversation came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Susan sat across from me, visibly nervous in a way I rarely saw from her, and explained that she'd been struggling with a specific, persistent feeling, a sense that she'd spent her entire adult life moving directly from her parents' house to our marriage without ever experiencing a period of genuine independence or exploration. She said she wasn't looking to end our marriage, that she loved me and intended to spend the rest of her life with me, but that she felt a genuine need for one night of experience outside our marriage before she could fully, wholeheartedly commit to the idea of growing old together without any lingering, unexplored curiosity. I sat with that request for a long moment before responding. I told her, honestly, that I understood the feeling she was describing, even if I didn't necessarily agree it required the specific solution she was proposing. But I also told her that I wasn't going to forbid her from making her own choice as an adult, and that if this was genuinely what she needed to move forward with real clarity, I wouldn't stand in her way. Here's what Susan didn't know that evening. Her request wasn't the first sign of restlessness I'd noticed. About 4 months earlier, I'd found a series of increasingly personal messages between Susan and a man named Marcus, someone she'd reconnected with through an old college network, messages that suggested an emotional intimacy already developing well beyond simple friendship, even if nothing physical had occurred yet. I hadn't confronted her about those messages directly. Instead, I'd spent those 4 months quietly, carefully evaluating my own feelings about our marriage's actual state, consulting with a therapist individually to work through my own confusion, and eventually meeting with a family law attorney simply to understand my position clearly, regardless of which direction things ultimately went. When Susan finally came to me with her request that Tuesday evening, framing it as a need for one night of general exploration, I recognized immediately that this was very likely connected to the relationship with Marcus I'd already been quietly aware of for months. Her request wasn't really asking permission for something abstract and unknown. It was asking permission for something specific that had already been emotionally underway for a while. I said yes to Susan's request, not because I was comfortable with it, and not because I didn't understand exactly what was likely actually happening. I said yes because I'd already concluded, over those 4 private months of reflection, that continuing our marriage required both of us being honest about where we actually stood, rather than me quietly enforcing boundaries around a connection that had probably already moved past the point where forbidding it would meaningfully change anything. I also said yes because I genuinely wanted clarity one way or another, rather than continuing an indefinite, ambiguous drift that neither of us was addressing honestly. If Susan's feelings for Marcus were significant enough to require exploring, I needed to know that clearly, rather than spending years quietly wondering. The evening Susan went to meet Marcus, I didn't spend the night anxiously waiting by the phone or torturing myself with anxious speculation. I made one phone call to my brother, Paul, someone I trusted completely and had already confided in during those 4 months of quiet reflection. I told Paul simply, "Tonight's the night I find out clearly what our marriage actually is. I wanted you to know, regardless of how it goes, that I'm at peace with whatever comes next, because I've already done the work of understanding my own position either way." That was the entire call. Not dramatic, not vengeful, simply a brother checking in with another brother during a genuinely significant moment, ensuring I had support regardless of outcome, rather than facing it in complete isolation. Susan came home late that night, and the conversation that followed was considerably more honest than either of us had managed in the preceding months. She told me, with visible difficulty, that her evening with Marcus had clarified something different than she'd initially expected. Not simple curiosity satisfied, but a genuine recognition that her feelings for him had already grown into something significant before that night even happened, feelings she'd been avoiding fully confronting by framing the situation as a single, contained exploration, rather than what it actually was. I told her calmly that I'd actually been aware of her messages with Marcus for several months already, and that I'd used that time to prepare myself emotionally and practically for exactly this kind of honest conversation, regardless of how it concluded. Susan and I ultimately decided to separate, amicably, over the following months, both of us recognizing that our marriage had genuinely run its course in a way that predated her request entirely. The separation, informed by my earlier preparation with our attorney, moved through relatively smoothly, without the drawn-out conflict that often accompanies divorces built on sudden, unprepared revelations. Susan and Marcus are together now, and honestly, our children have adjusted reasonably well to the new arrangement, partly because Susan and I have maintained a genuinely civil, cooperative co-parenting relationship throughout. I don't regret saying yes to Susan's request that evening, even knowing what I now understand it actually represented. I think, if I'd simply forbidden her from seeing Marcus outright, we would have spent years in a slower, more painful version of the same eventual outcome, built on resentment rather than honest clarity. That single phone call to my brother wasn't a dramatic act of revenge. It was simply the quiet action of someone who'd already done the difficult internal work necessary to face an uncertain evening with genuine peace, rather than anxious dread, regardless of what honesty ultimately revealed. If this story got to you, the next one is even more unexpected. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it.